See, I think that should be good.
Great.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to protect student and staff well-being in older educational buildings. We will discuss the hidden dangers in older buildings and buildings in general, as well as the importance of monitoring indoor air quality post-pandemic. Our guest speakers are John Simmerling, Lisa Greenfield, and JJ Baird. John is the Chief Science Officer at Trusted Client Solutions, where he leads scientific and clinical innovation in 3 key product categories: chronic disease management, air quality management, and emerging biotechnology. John brings a wealth of experience in healthcare and biosciences. He has held senior roles at globally recognized companies such as Philips, Nant Health, and McKesson, contributing to advancements in biotechnology, oncology, health informatics, and analytics. John was educated at Johns Hopkins University. And our next guest speaker is Lisa Greenfield. Lisa is an experienced educator with almost 20 years of teaching in public schools. Lisa is a dedicated consultant for the education of others regarding the importance of indoor air quality and the implementation of technologies to mitigate indoor air pollution. She is the National Indoor Air Quality Specialist for Erlab USA and is also a certified air filtration specialist. Lisa was educated at Drake University. JJ is the VP for the B2B division of Airthings in North America. He is based in Atlanta, Georgia, and is passionate about the Airthings mission, which is helping people breathe better by providing insights into the indoor air they are breathing. A fun fact about JJ is he is an aviation enthusiast, and to the dismay of some of our colleagues, he likes pineapple on pizza. We won't hold that against him, though. And lastly, I am Adriana Raibstein, a regional sales manager with Airthings B2B division. I am based near New Orleans, Louisiana. My focus is on raising awareness of the importance of continuous indoor air quality monitoring for both occupants and buildings. And I believe in the power of data to transform spaces to enhance occupant well-being. A fun fact about me, in my spare time, I enjoy doing carpentry work and volunteering my skill set with organizations such as Habitat for Humanity. A few housekeeping items. We will be recording the webinar, so if you registered, you will receive a link to the recording afterwards. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We will have a Q&A session at the end. The webinar will last approximately 45 minutes, including the Q&A session. If we do not have time to get to all the questions, please feel free to reach out to us at business-support@airthings.com, and we will be happy to answer your questions via email. Also, feel free to connect with us all on LinkedIn. So I'll share a bit about Airthings for those who may not be familiar with us. We are a global leader in indoor air quality monitoring technology. Our technology provides IAQ insights to help optimize your workspace well-being and building's performance. We have over 1 million business devices installed worldwide, and this includes over 30,000 classrooms. We will begin with an in-depth presentation from John on the uniqueness of IAQ in higher ed and the potential hidden dangers in buildings. Then we will discuss with Lisa her experience as an educator working in an environment with poor indoor air quality and as a student studying in such an environment and how these influenced her career change. And then JJ will take a few minutes to discuss the importance of correctly and continuously monitoring your indoor air quality and the valuable insights the data offers. As I mentioned earlier, we will have a Q&A session if time allows. And before we get started, we'd love to hear about what made you join the webinar today. So you should see a poll on your screen now, and we'll take a few seconds to allow you to answer that. All right, that should be good. So without further ado, John, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. If you could pull up that first slide. First of all, I want to lead this presentation by saying I'm from Chicago, and we do not put pineapple on our pizzas. We love deep dish pizza, and just like we don't put ketchup on hot dogs, pineapple is forbidden on our pizzas. The focus today, as we've introduced it and broadcast it, is about higher education and what is unique about higher education in terms of indoor air quality. And I think a good place to start with that is we've all been in 100 level, I think, classes where you're sitting in an auditorium. There's a lot of students in there, and they're all sharing the same air. They all have their gear with them, and they're in a high density environment, which I think is characteristic of higher education. And higher education also has a wide variety of buildings, variations in buildings, building age, their envelope, how they're ventilated. And because those buildings are so diverse and so spread across campuses, the variability in each of those buildings in terms of air quality can be really significant. So higher education is a place where we really need to focus indoor air quality measurements, and it's been long overdue. We've spent a lot of time focusing on secondary education, and there are certain reasons for that, which we'll talk about later. But we want to focus on infectious and non-communicable diseases, which can harm students, as well as the reputation of higher education, universities, organizations, etc. Lastly, I want to say that across the campus, we also want to measure the differences between buildings and the differences in spaces. I also want to point out that on the right side of the slides here, I have citations which will bring you to the source data for what I'm going to discuss. When you receive this presentation, you'll be able to click on those links and bring up more information about what I've just presented to you on this slide. So let's move on to the next slide. So the first thing we want to identify is what makes up good indoor air quality, right? And there's a subset of 4 or 5, maybe 6 items that are the most important elements to measure. But, as far as indoor air goes, WHO says 90% of the global population is currently exposed to poor air quality levels indoors, which is where we spend most of our time. As far as the key measures go, we're looking at particulate matter. This is fine and ultra-fine matter, and this goes back to how this matter, this particulate matter, enters into our cells, our organs, our bloodstream. All goes back to Einstein in 1905, talking about diffusion, and again, more on that later, or in a subsequent webinar. The other thing we're going to be measuring is gases, CO2 in particular. We know that affects cognition and learning, the ability to synthesize critical information, our ability to have mental clarity, to take tests, things like that, particularly important in higher education. Volatile organic compounds, which we'll get to on the next slide, shows or has an effect, a sometimes significant short and long-term effect on certain pathologies, and volatile compounds are therefore measured in 2 ways. One of them is just a single volatile compound, formaldehyde, and one is a collection of compounds, TVOCs, which is about 27 compounds. We'll talk about that later. And then temperature and humidity, they're both related not just to thermal comfort, but also how aerosolization occurs and such, suspending particulate matter, and also microbial growth. So we'll talk about that more later, but it's important to know that these are the kinds of things that we're going to be measuring. Next slide. Now, a lot of you guys probably don't understand when I say fine and ultrafine particles. PM 2.5 is 2.5 microns. And to give you a sense for how small that particle is, you could look at the right side of the slide and see that not only is it much smaller than a grain of sand, but it's also incredibly smaller than even a single strand of hair. So small, in fact, that it's the size, it can be the size of a single 3-atom molecule, as you would see there. Why is that important? It's important because, as I said before, it can pass directly into our cells through our epithelial tissue and diffuse into cells. When it does so, if you look at the left side of the screen, you'll see that those particles aren't just carbon. It's not just one thing, it's many things. And a lot of these compounds hitch a ride on these small particles. And when they do that, they bring with them arsenic, lead, nitrates, sulfates, other things that can be harmful to our bodies. They're present, these particles are, in the byproducts of automobile fuel, fossil combustion, wildfires, and a lot more things, including manufacturing, which you'll see here in a minute. And again, the size is 2.5 microns, but they can be as small as 1 micron. So you'll see that a lot of indoor air quality measures will measure both 2.5 and 1. And if 2.5 isn't bad enough, 1's worse. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. I said before, volatile organic compounds, a lot of you folks on this webinar probably understand this better than others. But let's just, looking at that visual there, understand that there are a host of different types of chemical compounds, whether they're inorganic or organic, that can affect the physical processes of our bodies, have a physiological effect. They can affect neurological processes and other things that have a significant effect, short-term and long-term. And a good example of this would be what we found most recently, and I hope some of you on this webinar have learned about this. But at Poe Hall at North Carolina State, over the last few years, there's been a particular interest in one of these compounds called a PCB, which has led to a long-term effect of a cancer cluster related specifically to that room. So you can see why measuring a volatile organic compound is important. Once we measure it, we can go deeper into it and determine what kind of compound it is and then come up with a remediation. Next slide. So these are just a couple of graphics. I grew up in Chicago, and on the left side of the graphic, you can see some of those steel mills that are in Indiana, Gary, Indiana, and areas like that. And as they release those particles, they're releasing volatile compounds, particulate matter, gases, all kinds of dangerous things. And as they flow across the lake toward Chicago, where I grew up, you can see definitive results in terms of the longevity, which is cited elsewhere in this presentation. Between those who live on the south side of Chicago and on the north side of Chicago, the differences in expected lifespan are about as high as 10 years. So the correlation between pollution and lifespan is very significant. On the right side, you'll see that a building envelope is important as well. We open our windows, our doors, many ways that these exterior pollutants can get inside of our houses. So it's very important to measure all of those things inside of our houses. And as we'll talk about later with JJ, even outside in our local and regional environments. Next slide.
And before we move to the next slide, John, too, I also want to mention, I think it's important to note that there are many things that can contribute to the VOCs in classrooms? If you want to name a few, or I'll name
Oh,
them.
sure. I can definitely name a few. Poe Hall is a good example. The Poe Hall at North Carolina State is attributed to the building materials that were used inside of that particular classroom. So building materials, even when students enter a classroom and occupancy levels rise, the things that they bring with them into that classroom, backpacks, clothing, other items, even cell phones,
Perfumes.
they can perfumes, things like that. They can temporarily increase the VOCs in that environment. And JJ is going to show you some really good examples of that when he does his presentation later. So those are things that can contribute, but I would say building materials, carpeting, paint, varnishes on furniture, a lot of things can raise VOC levels in an area.
Thank you.
So one of the things I was asked to talk about is the importance of indoor air quality in education. And some of this is duplicative, but when you have highly occupied classrooms, we do expect that there are going to be increased levels of pollutants and particles. Some of that is because the occupants are actually breathing CO2 into the air. And as soon as they arrive in a classroom, you're going to see elevated levels of CO2, elevated levels, as I mentioned before, of volatile compounds. And as they're moving and shuffling into the classroom, they're aerosolizing particles. So those are things that we can expect to be periodic, maybe just for 5 minutes until they're remediated by ventilation. So that's an important thing to understand about higher education and indoor air quality. The other things, as I've said before, is, when you breathe out CO2 or you have poor ventilation or both, and you have a significant impact on your ability to synthesize information, to think clearly, to be able to take tests well. And the best example I can give of this is if any of you have taken a law school entrance exam or a medical MCAT test or any kind of really important test that determines your future, your ability to gain entrance to higher education beyond, beyond your bachelor's degree, the choice you make of where to take that test could definitely influence whether you actually get into law school or medical school because of the direct link to the indoor air quality in that room, right? So I think that's really important to understand, and it brings to the forefront of the importance of indoor air quality in one specific space. Also, we're seeing an awareness on the part of parents and students that's unprecedented. Recent studies have shown that over half of parents that have high school students are now considering the indoor air quality among the top 3 most important factors in choosing a higher education campus. And the last thing I would say is, again, Poe Hall and other examples, is that the schools themselves understand that there's a liability in terms of the safety, the risk, the harm, and ultimately the reputation of that school, which we'll talk about more on the next slide.
John, I have a few questions for you, and we'll keep them short to be mindful of time. But what would you say is the cost-benefit analysis for IAQ?
Well, that's really related to a lot of the things I've talked about previously. I would say that when what we experienced during COVID, when campuses had to close down and students were sent home, it had a dramatic financial impact on colleges and universities. The businesses, the students going home, the question of what am I getting for a remote education versus an on-site education, and the significant loss of enrollment. And one primary element of that is dormitories, cafeterias, all the things that contribute to the financial benefit or the revenue of a college. So being able to understand the air quality, to be able to spot something that is of concern and to remediate it as quickly as possible has a great benefit financially for higher education.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to consider the long-term commitment that's required to maintain these improvements, right? And engaging with stakeholders, such as the parents that you mentioned, students and faculty, can help build support for ongoing investments in IAQ.
That's right, and we'll talk about that later. But it's important to note that here it is, right? It's important to note that we're trying to see the unseen, right? We have an invisible problem, which we never really realized until COVID, the COVID crisis hit, and people were confused at first, and then they started learning about how air quality had a direct effect first on infectious disease with COVID, and then later on other things like CO2. One of the first things that colleges and universities did was when they were told that ventilation is the most important thing, the only way to understand ventilation in their mind was the carbon dioxide levels, which were directly linked to quality and importance of ventilation. So a lot of education was gained during the COVID crisis, and since then the priorities have been set by boards, by schools of of measuring the unseen, the invisible, that thing that can contribute to the closing of schools now and in the future and prevent financial loss for both students and for the universities. And again, I've cited some of that information on the right side.
You're right. And you mentioned the invisible problem, and that's why we can't express enough the importance of monitoring the indoor air quality, because a lot of times, the things that can affect our health, we can't smell them, we can't see them, we can't touch them. So it is important to continuously monitor.
Right. You're not going to. You might be able to smell a wildfire smoke coming from your room, but for most places, excluding wildfires, those particles and gases and volatile compounds typically can't be identified because they're seen. However, I will relate a story of walking through a college, and they were varnishing the gymnasium floor, and they took me in there, and I was shocked at how immediately it affected me with this very potent veneer that they were putting on the gymnasium floor. And those are things that can escape the building, they can penetrate other areas of the building, and they are definitely volatile organic compounds. We can move on.
Yeah, and that was one. That's a good example, because that was one that you could actually smell. Right?
Yeah, you can actually smell that.
Imagine the ones that you
can't smell a PCB or most volatile compounds, but something that's as strong as that is an acute problem. And if you had indoor air quality monitors in that building, your TVOC levels would be off the charts, and you would immediately be able to say, we've got to do something to remediate this issue.
Right. Okay.
So another question that was posed by Adrian and others, and some of the participants here, is what's the role of indoor air quality in how universities are planning long-term plans, short-term plans in higher education? Universities typically don't do anything in the short term. They have longer-term strategic plans because of the nature of a higher education institution. Their budgets are larger. They have to plan in advance, and they won't do anything typically in the short term for all those reasons. So they have to include indoor air quality in strategic planning. Some of them have adopted, some universities have taken the initial step of adopting standards. Some of them have placed indoor air quality measures in certain parts of their campus. But what's really needed is leadership. If you are not measuring indoor air quality in your higher education environment, you are not making a good choice. And colleges and universities understand that. And so even though it's indoor air quality is a major factor in new building design, as it shows there, some of those new buildings can actually emit VOCs as well, and they're not as pure and clean in air as you might think. So I think we're going to get to this in the next slide, but in order to be able to identify what needs to be placed into the budget and what needs to be planned for, not short term, but longer term, midterm, is to roll out an indoor air quality monitoring device in certain buildings where you know you may have a problem, to collect that data, to educate the board and the planners and the budgeting committees on why you have a problem, how you have a problem, and why you need to start implementing it across a wider stretch of your campus. I don't think that it's possible to do that by just saying we need an indoor air quality monitoring everywhere. Yeah. Colleges are not going to do that.
Absolutely. So, we know that funding sometimes is an issue, budget is an issue. So we've been able to successfully secure funding for larger deployments by first launching a pilot. So by taking that initial step and being able to demonstrate clear results through data, we've improved our ability to secure the resources needed for broader implementations. And that's actually worked out really well. So let's go ahead and move on. We're running a bit over time here.
All right, I think this is pretty self-explanatory, right? When you're doing continuous monitoring, you're not taking a sampling of data. JJ will show you this later in the presentation, but you're continuously collecting that data so that you can make better decisions about whether something is a period, a point in time where you have a spike in certain indoor air quality measures, or whether you have a chronic problem or an acute problem, and that can lead you to understanding where you need to place your mitigation strategies. So I think it's important that if you're not serious about indoor air quality, if you're not doing some kind of monitoring, and then as you capture this data, you'll be able to extend that to a broader and broader area of your higher education campus.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, John. That was very enlightening and informative. We appreciate you sharing your wealth of knowledge with us today. And so now, Lisa, welcome. We are happy you could join us today. We know that maintaining a healthy environment is crucial for both students and staff, and air quality plays a significant role in that. So as we've discussed, with John throughout this webinar, poor air quality can significantly affect our health and learning ability. Continuous IAQ monitoring offers numerous benefits, enhancing the well-being for the occupants and performance of everyone in an educational setting. So to begin with, let's look at this as just having somewhat of a fireside chat, if you would, right? Can you tell us what inspired you to advocate for healthy indoor air quality in education?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, Adriana, and also Airthings. It's great to be here. What inspired me was chronic illness, experiencing respiratory illness, working in environments with, that had mold, and in doing that, creating the health issues that came from that, also having COVID, that created illness that lasted for months, and that affected my coworkers and the students, and also being in school at the time and teaching. It challenges many educator, and it's not an unusual story, and it's something that with our aging educational structures, we need to be addressing more of, because we're having a lot of people have health issues from the environment they work in, whether it be from a sick building or from infectious aerosols.
Yeah, that's yeah. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I can't imagine how challenging it must be to have, or must have been, to teach and learn in such a difficult environment, especially while dealing with health issues of your own. So your experience highlights a critical aspect of indoor air quality and how profoundly it affects not just individual health, but also the overall learning environment for everyone. So how did your experience as an educator shape your views on the importance of air quality in the learning environment?
That's a great question. I think when we think about the learning environment, we sometimes forget what it's really like to be in a shared space like that with a lot of people. You oftentimes, feel kind of sleepy after a while, not because of boredom from the topic, but because of higher CO2 levels. As we talked about, that affects our cognitive abilities, our productivity, our ultimate ability to retain information, and our overall academic success. So having healthier indoor air is, really kind of foundational to great learning and supporting the educational staff as well.
Absolutely. It's true that factors like CO2 levels or increased CO2 levels can significantly affect our cognitive abilities. I do recall the times, I felt sleepy in class, even in my work life during a meeting. We've all been there during a meeting in a crowded conference room, or in a seminar where there was no ventilation or little ventilation. We were starting to get that sleepy feeling. So definitely can relate to that. So what specific health issues related to air quality did you notice among students and staff and yourself during your teaching career?
Yeah, so one of the things that was commonplace were respiratory illness. We know that respiratory illness, there's over like 200 different kinds of cold viruses, if you didn't know that, which is why younger kids are like sick all the time with runny noses. Those are infectious aerosols. They hang out in the air. When we're breathing what other people have exhaled, like we're breathing in 3% of what they've exhaled. And really the common cold is the biggest trigger for asthma. And almost 10% of our college population has asthma. So if you think about it, that has a great effect on, what asthma trigger. It kind of domino effects into absenteeism. And all of those things can ultimately lead to falling behind and even dropping out. So you see a lot of that in school, and, what's in the air directly affects not just infectious aerosols, but pollutants and particulates and VOCs. Those all exacerbate asthma.
Absolutely. Wow, that is insightful. I was not aware that there are over 200 different cold viruses. So
Yeah.
it is surprising how many factors contribute to the spread of respiratory illness.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let's see. I have one more question for you. Looking ahead, what changes do you hope to see in policies related to indoor air quality in learning educational environments?
Yeah, well, one of the things, if you haven't already heard about it, is ASHRAE 241, which is a standard set by the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. And basically, the United States government commissioned them to create a standard to help prevent the spread of infectious aerosols. And this came about because of COVID. COVID really made us aware of what's in the air and what can really make us sick. And when implementing this, it's an infection risk management mode. So when you have higher rates of illness, implement this type of ventilation strategy and dilute those pollutants. great way to help mitigate. It's a wonderful way to not have to throw a whole bunch of kinds of different technology because you don't always have the ability to do that funding wise in schools. And then the other thing is excited to see this happening in Washington, D.C., the Indoor Air Quality and Healthy Schools Act of 2024. And basically, this act advances the EPA's 3 key strategies for indoor air quality and improving it, which is source control of the pollutants, and which is NIOSH hierarchy of controls, improved ventilation, and the filtration of indoor air. So this bill has been sent to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, and I think it's a step in the right direction on showing us the way on how to improve indoor air quality in our educational spaces. And prioritizing indoor air quality for many reasons. It promotes health, reduces liability. It's great for the reputation of the school, improves learning, can even help increase, your productivity, leading to an overall improved experience and well-being for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely. ASHRAE 241 is a significant step forward in establishing those standards that can really make a difference in our buildings. And I lied, Lisa. I do have one more question for you, if you don't mind. So,
not at all.
What role do you believe technology plays in monitoring and improving IAQ in educational settings, but not just in educational settings, really in all buildings, because we don't want to be in sick buildings?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in this space now for about 3 years, and one of the things that I'm seeing is building automation systems. I see that in the future, it really kind of takes the pressure off the facilities managers and constantly having to monitor everything. And artificial intelligence basically runs these programs. And I love this quote by Peter Drucker. He says, "You can't manage what you don't measure," which is exactly why we're here today, right? We need to know what's going on in indoor air so that we can do the things to mitigate and make the air healthier. So instead of waiting for illness to happen or, say mold to happen because we're not ventilating properly, monitoring for it is the best thing that we can do, and keeping up on preventative maintenance as well. I think doing those things can help prevent a lot of issues.
Again, I completely agree. So building automation systems are a game changer for facilities management. And by leveraging AI and real-time monitoring, we can proactively address issues before they escalate, which is vital for maintaining optimal indoor air quality. Well, Lisa, it's been a pleasure discussing these important topics with you. I appreciate you sharing your experience and your insights, and look forward to continued conversations with you.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And JJ, the floor is yours.
Okay, wonderful. Hey, everyone. Super nice to actually be here. And it's also super nice to see, from the scientific community and from Lisa's experience, sort of the passion that people have for indoor air quality and the passion that this entire industry has for kids and for better learning outcomes, I think, for everyone that's in here. And we as Airthings is so excited to be part of that journey. And, we really care when it comes to monitoring the air and putting the data in the people's hands to help them evaluate what's actually going on inside of their buildings. So I'm going to do a very quick run through of what it is that we can help people with and some of the things that we've seen in the past, and put some, our money where our mouth is in terms of the scientific part of this, in terms of what does this actually look like in real life and bringing that aspect to it. So hit that next slide there, Adriana. Perfect. So the main goal that we have at Airthings, and you kind of hear this across the industry as well, is how do we make the invisible visible? How do we take things that we, and you heard it today, like there are things that we can smell, there are things that we can sense as humans, like if we sit in a space that's hot or we sit in a space that's humid, or there's maybe wildfires around, there's usually some sort of smell to that, but there's actually a very large portion of the things that we experience in spaces that we cannot smell or sense at all that actually does have long-term impacts. Things like radon is the biggest cause of lung cancer in the US for non-smokers. And there's types of VOCs and types of smoke that us as humans just cannot detect, but by the fact that we're not measuring it means that it kind of goes completely unknown to us that it's actually happening there. So we try and bring, and especially in educational institutions, you could have hundreds of buildings, and how do you make sense of hundreds of buildings, billions of data points that could be coming in over a weekly period, and then say, where is the focus that we need to place within our buildings? And this is what we try and do really well, is really break it down for customers to say, this is the focus area, this is where things are the worst, this is where you're going to get the best return for the money that you're putting in. Next slide, Adriana. So I wanted to take one customer case that we saw, and some of you might have seen this before. I love talking about this one. We had a customer that was having headaches in the office. They couldn't smell anything, they couldn't see anything, but they could tell that people were not feeling great in the office. They pulled up the Airthings data, and in the Airthings data, what we're able to see is every time the heat started increasing in the office, so essentially, as soon as the thermostat said, it's starting to get cold, let's add some heat into the space, we saw a very strong increase in the number of volatile organic compounds that were actually in the air. And then when they went to inspect the mechanical room where the furnace and the HVAC equipment was at, they found that one of the test ports was actually not capped. So someone tested the air coming out of it, they never put the cap back on, and so air was flowing into the mechanical room. That air in the mechanical room was being mixed in there and then being pulled back in through the systems into the air that's going through the actual building. And so it actually was a pretty dangerous situation. And by having the Airthings sensors, they were actually able to figure out what the problem was and where to actually look, which was really nice. I mean, I think we always try and tell customers to sort of take a three-step approach, is always start by measuring, analyze the data, look at what's going wrong, and then where it makes sense, do some automation. But the value of data in itself is a very understated thing within buildings. So what I'm going to do now, and I know I only have another 2 minutes, but I want to quickly steal the screen share here from Adriana. And what I'm going to do, just kind of show you what this looks like from within the Airthings dashboard. So the first thing that we have is this concept of all of your buildings, seeing your buildings at a glance, and then figuring out, where do I need to focus? Where are my biggest problem points? So here what I did is we said, okay, where do we have buildings that have had VOCs over 250 parts per billion over the last 7 days? And here I can clearly see, okay, this particular building has had an issue with 15 out of the 39 devices, and the worst affected room was affected for 2 hours and 51 minutes within that particular 7-day period. If I then go into the building itself, I can then start to understand, how is my building comparing between the outside, which we will tell you the outside temperature, we'll tell you the outside humidity, as well as the outside particulates, the number of particulates according to weather data for the building address. And then it helps you actually compare, how is your building performing and how good a job is your building doing at keeping the outdoor conditions outside of the indoor conditions, especially in really cold situations or during a wildfire event and things like that. We also then allow you to go straight into the insights. And one thing we love to talk about is, how do we make insights actionable? How do we give you something that you can quickly find out, where do I need to focus and how do I actually action those particular items? So from here, you can see CO2 on the 11th was over that 1,000 mark on the 11th. And then these are the devices that contributed to that. And then I can very quickly understand, well, what contributed to this, what was the trend associated with that event. And I could even zoom further in there and sort of understand, how did this happen? And then if I need to understand, how does this work with all of the other data points that we're looking at? So if I want to say, okay, there's that spike that we just saw, but what actually happened at exactly the same time? So if I go down, I can see, well, I can see VOC went up. So likely these humans were wearing perfume. There was something from a humanistic perspective that was causing a VOC rise. What's interesting here is I can see here we have high VOC to the right, but we don't actually have that same CO2 increase at the same time, which tells me here that the building is actually introducing this VOC and it's not coming from humans. So by understanding these interrelated data points and able to go all the way down and figure out what is actually happening in our buildings, we can really start to assess, how do we solve these problems? Is it things that can be solved by ventilation? Is it something that's solved by looking at how we design and how we outfit our buildings? And having the data is really the key part of understanding what that next steps are for our higher education buildings, for our schools and corporate buildings. So I've spent a little more time than I should. We'd love to do a full presentation. To anyone that's interested, please do reach out to us. Please do put your questions in the chat. We'll be happy to get back to you on any of those as well. Generally we're just here to help, and we're just passionate about solving air quality issues for our customers.
Thank you, JJ. We are running out of time, and we do want to be mindful of everyone's time. And we do have a few questions in the chat box, and we will be happy to respond to those via email. We appreciate you guys, taking the time with us today. Just a few key takeaways that I do want to go over real quickly is, IAQ in secondary and higher education presents unique challenges. Poor IAQ negatively impacts academic performance, well-being, and can damage the institution's reputation. Airborne pollutants can impact our respiratory health, and prolonged exposure can lead to serious health problems. Aging infrastructure can amplify underlying issues and directly contribute to poor indoor air quality. And continuous IAQ monitoring helps make informed decisions. And that's the key point that we definitely want to drive home today, is that by monitoring, exactly what is going on with your indoor air quality. All of our lives, we've been told to worry about our outdoor air, and there's not much we can do about that. But if we know what is going on inside our indoor air that we are breathing, we can take, make informed decisions to improve that. And then lastly, increased awareness about IAQ post-COVID is driving the demand for better IAQ standards. And we are seeing that, coming up through Washington, D.C. And that is pretty much it, guys. I apologize that we ran out of time for the questions, but we will answer the questions that we have via email. Thank you all for your time today.